What would it take to convince you to leave everything behind and restart your life in a new country? And what if that country was North Korea? That is exactly what was happening here as the first ships left the port of Niigata in western Japan for Wonsan, North Korea. In total, nearly 100,000 people were convinced to trade their lives in Japan for a future in the reclusive authoritarian state. To understand why is to explore a story about colonialism, war, discrimination, and propaganda that continues to profoundly impact many people's lives, decades after it happened.
It's like a hostage. We have to be loyal to North Korean government so that we can protect them.
Today, in Japan, some 26,000 people identify themselves as North Koreans. They represent only a small fraction of Japan's ethnic Korean residents, and an even smaller proportion of the nation's overall population. But not long ago, Japan's North Korean community was much larger. One of the biggest reasons it shrunk is because so many people were convinced to leave for a land that they were told was a paradise on earth, North Korea. But to fully understand how this happened, we must first go back to the start of Japan's colonial ambitions in the Korean peninsula. Tessa Morris-Suzuki is an academic at the Australian National University who has conducted extensive interviews with members of Japan's Korean community about the Return to Paradise program.
So the story really begins with the Japanese colonization of Korea in the early 20th century. And while Korea was a Japanese colony, there was quite large-scale migration from Korea to Japan.
Japan's colonial ambitions ended with its surrender in World War II.
The unconditional surrender of Japan.
By the end of the war, some 2 million ethnic Koreans were in Japan, while the majority returned to a newly independent Korean peninsula. About 600,000 remained in Japan, many settling in large cities like Tokyo and Osaka.
This is Tokyo, 1948.
Life in post-war Japan was far from easy. In the colonial era, Koreans were considered Japanese nationals. But once the American post-war occupation of Japan ended in 1952, all Koreans, even those who were born in Japan, were suddenly designated as foreigners. Japan classified its ethnic Korean population as Zainichi Koreans, a term that referred to them as foreign residents, despite living in the country for generations.
Their situation was absolutely a legal limbo. This meant that they were not eligible for a lot of areas of employment that required Japanese nationality. So really all areas of public employment, even, quite low-level local government jobs or working as a teacher or whatever, at that time, you had to be a Japanese national.
Hyung-Soo Park remembers the difficulties of growing up as a Zainichi Korean in Kobe, near the Japanese city of Osaka.
There was a serious discrimination against Koreans in Japan. We were told we were foreigners here, so I thought, maybe we have two identities. Sometimes I had to act like a Japanese, but sometimes not. Sometimes I have to be very Korean.
For many Zainichi Koreans at the time, the General Association of Korean Residents in Japan, or the Chongryon, offered a sense of belonging and the support of a wider community. The organization also offered a direct connection with Korea. But by then, the peninsula was divided by war, and Chongryon's allegiances were with Pyongyang, not Seoul.
If you go back to the 1950s, I think that quite widely, North Korea was regarded as being more prosperous than South Korea, but also perhaps as having a brighter future. I think one of the important things to remember is that South Korea was a dictatorship for much of that period too.
Seoul, capital of South Korea, had a riot on its hands. The country's had a general election. It gave 84-year-old President Syngman Rhee a huge majority. But the losers say that one way and another, it was rigged.
So you had two countries which were both dictatorships, but there was a sense that North Korea was developing its industry more rapidly. Chongnyeong, when it was set up in 1955, began to receive a lot of funding from North Korea and used that funding particularly to set up schools where children could get educated in the Korean language. And that was very important for the Korean community. There was this network of schools that was created and attracted a lot of students, not many of them, I suppose, with parents who were pro-North Korean, but some who simply wanted to find a good Korean language education for their children.
My family belonged to the pro-North Korean community. At that time, it was maybe 70s. More than 80% of Zainichi belonged to pro-North Korean community. And the North Korean regime supported the Zainichi community faster than the South Korean government. So Kim Il-sung supported, funded Korean schools. So my father started to go to the Korean school, even though my grandmother really didn't like the North Korean government, because she saw the Korean War and how evil the communists are. That's what she said. She saw something terrible the communists have done to people.
Seoul lies in ruins.
And she said, they are so evil, they could kill so many people because of the ideology. But there was no school that my father could go.
In the beginning, the school curriculum offered a broader take on Korean identity, culture, and history. But by the 1960s, the school began to focus heavily on North Korean ideology.
このビデオカセットは親愛なる指導者キム・ジョンイル先生が私たち学生のために
So ideology was an important part of the education in the Chongnyeong schools, and certainly it was a factor in the repatriation movement, that it encouraged children to think very positively of North Korea. It encouraged them to look up to Kim Il-sung.
They said our fatherland is North Korea. There was a portrait in the classroom, and the school had a big slogan on the top of the building. It said, "Thank you, Marshal Kim Il-sung."
In the late 1950s, Pyongyang started to push the idea that Zainichi Koreans would live far better lives if they abandoned Japan and resettled in North Korea. By 1959, what was called the Return to Paradise repatriation program began with Chongryeon media publishing glowing stories about life in Kim Il-sung's socialist paradise.
School told us that, the socialist fatherland will provide everything we need, and the returnees are living happily ever after.
The propaganda was also offering Zainichi Koreans something intangible, but incredibly important.
I think a really important thing, which was not a trick, was that they would have citizenship. They'd be North Korean citizens. They wouldn't have any uncertainties about, their future residence rights and so on. But then also they were promised apartments, jobs, education for their children, the possibility for children to go to university.
In total, nearly 94,000 people moved to North Korea. For most, it was a one-way trip. Once they arrived in North Korea, they were subjected to the same strict controls as the rest of the North Korean population, including being barred from leaving the country without approval from authorities in Pyongyang.
There are different phases in the repatriation process. So the great majority of people who went in the first year, and at that stage, none of them had had a chance to go to North Korea before that. So they really didn't know, what sort of place they were going to. I think a lot of people were shocked to find that the jobs that they were going into were quite harsh, manual labor, jobs in coal mines and things like that, that sometimes they were being sent to quite remote parts of the country. And just the sheer poverty of North Korea compared with Japan.
We receive all kinds of letters and phone calls from Pyongyang that, asking for money and support. So we knew, they are having a hard time there. But actually, I went there and I saw my cousins and how they envy of me, and they complained about their life there, and they wanted to know about the life in Japan, My cousin even said, "Oh, you smelled different." She loved my smell, even my smell. and they're all depressed, you know. There is no freedom. There's no freedom of speech. There's no freedom of moving around.
The Japanese government was intercepting these letters and citing them in reports, not confidential reports. These were not things that were made public, to show how bad the economic situation in North Korea was. So the Japanese government was clearly aware of this, but they didn't do anything to make this public or to stop the repatriation.
Why would Japanese officials hide the reality of life in North Korea? Recently declassified documents from the Japanese Red Cross Society detailed the country's secret involvement in the North Korean repatriation program from the very beginning.
I went to the Red Cross as I knew that it had been involved in the repatriation of Koreans from Japan to North Korea. They had just declassified their very large archive on the topic. And I started reading it, and it was sort of, wow, this is not the story that I thought it was going to be. The conventional story about how the repatriation began was that it started with a repatriation movement in 1958, which was inspired by the North Korean government. And certainly at that time, all of a sudden, the North Korean government started inviting Koreans from Japan to come and settle, and offering them all sorts of wonderful things, houses and employment and education and so on. But the thing that I found in my research and that really surprised me was how much earlier the whole process had begun, and that it actually went back almost to the end of the Korean War, to around 1953, and that very early on you get documents from the Japanese government and from the Japanese Red Cross Society where they are talking about the idea of a mass repatriation from Japan to North Korea, because from the point of view of the Japanese government, the Korean community was, to put it bluntly, a nuisance, I suppose, was the way they saw it. They felt that it was an impoverished community. They were worried about the fact that many Koreans were left-wing, and for them, the ideal solution would be a large-scale repatriation to Korea. And the problem at that time, from the Japanese government's point of view, was that South Korea was not really interested in accepting large numbers of Koreans from Japan. So then there was the idea of, well, perhaps we can somehow come to an arrangement with North Korea.
Japan offered use of a port in Niigata, a city on the nation's west coast where local governments helped register those who hoped to make the journey to North Korea.
There was an enormous amount of support from Japanese officials. The whole thing would have been impossible without Japanese official support.
The program ran from 1959 to 1984. Park's uncle was among those who made the move, and she visited her North Korean family twice in the 1990s, before they were all detained and disappeared into the regime's prison camps. That was when Park decided to sever ties with the North Korean community in Japan.
I thought it could be me. It could be my, destination, because my parents wanted to go to North Korea too. So, it was just terrible just imagining, it could be me. I decided, maybe I should go outside the community. That's why I decided to escape, from Cheongryun community, and I decided to go to the United States to learn some English.
Park now lives in South Korea, where she works with North Korean defectors.
I started as a volunteer worker. I support a North Korean defector. I help them shopping and how to use ATM machines and how to use transportation. They don't know anything, so I started to work with the YouTube channel, which is the recording the North Korean defectors' testimony, their life story. I wanted so many Zainichi Koreans to see and know the reality of North Korea that we never learned.
In 2006, Japan banned all North Korean ships from its national waters, ending the twice-a-month ferry service connecting Niigata with the North Korean port city of Wonsan. Chongryon nearly collapsed in financial ruin in the late 1990s, but it continues to run North Korean schools in Japan. It has never apologized for its role in the Return to Paradise program. Activists also say the Japanese government has made little effort to address its own role in the program.
I think the view in Japan at the moment is that it was very much North Korea's responsibility, North Korea and Chongnam. Certainly North Korea and Chongnam have a big share in the responsibility. But from my perspective, so does the Japanese government and so does the Japanese Red Cross Society.
To learn more about Hyung-Soo Park's personal story and her efforts to discover what happened to her missing family in North Korea, watch this video next.